Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final event of BioLit Talks Crossing Science with Humanities. A very warm welcome back to those of you that have joined us this month and have journeyed with us, and a very warm welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. It's always great to see new faces. I'm Sofia Sandali. I'm a PhD student in infection biology at the University of Glasgow, and I will be one of the chairs for this event. We once again have three incredible speakers, and we will shortly be introducing them to you. But before we get started, as usual, I'll say a few words of introduction to the event as a whole. So for those of you who are new to BioLit Talks, it is an event series that we have been running over the past few weeks, and throughout which we have been discussing the ways in which biology and literature have developed alongside one another and have influenced each other against the common backdrop of infectious diseases. And by so doing, we've hoped to help us rethink the ways that we imagine, understand, and portray infectious diseases. This evening in particular, we're focusing on the representation of infectious diseases in Latin American literature with a specific focus on cholera, although we will undoubtedly be touching on other diseases as well. And it's wonderful to be closing with this event because in a way it brings us back to where we started. So we began by looking at emerging pathogens in contemporary literature. So literature of the 21st century, then we took a step back to the 1800s. We went as back as the 16th century. And today we're mostly focused on 20th century literature. So it's back to a starting point. And throughout these sessions, we've had the chance to explore how and when infectious diseases have been represented in literature, but there have been fewer opportunities to delve into the whys. So why have infectious diseases been chosen as backdrops or metaphors or sources of inspiration? And I think this session will give us a greater opportunity to do so. I'm also excited to be talking about Latin American literature. So whereas the biology side of infectious diseases, we've discussed it naturally from a universal point of view, most of our literature and history discussions have been based on Europe. So it's definitely exciting to touch on a portion of literature that is perhaps less known or less appreciated. Lastly, the infectious disease we'll mostly be focusing on is cholera. And even though over the last few sessions, we've definitely had the chance to delve both into the past and the present, and in many ways the future as well, cholera is a disease that is very much associated to socioeconomic conditions. And I think that over the past few years, we've all grown so much more aware of how health is in many ways still a privilege. So being able to give this awareness a place and space to be discussed is something I'm looking forward to doing. And now, a familiar face to all of you who have been with us before, I'd like to introduce you to my fellow co-chair for this evening, Michael Dearwater, who is a doctoral student in creative writing, also at the University of Glasgow. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Sophia. Hello, everyone. Just to echo Sophia's welcome, it's good to see some of you returning and the new faces here. Many of you will know this already, but the format we're going to run with tonight is a brief introduction from each of our three guests, our three main guests here. That'll run for about 5 minutes or so. After that, we'll launch into our discussion, where we'll run through a series of talking points and delve deeper into their subject areas and the topics Sophia talked about. During that time, the chat will be running. If you want to talk about anything that's happening, we will have half an eye on it, but mostly we'll be saving questions for a 10-minute or so slot at the end when we'll put your questions to the speakers. And at the end of the event, there'll also be a short survey. And if you could fill that in for us when you're leaving, that would be much appreciated. So first up, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Patricia Novillo Corvalán, reader in comparative literature at the University of Kent, who'll tell us a bit more about her work.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Sophia and Michael, for inviting me to take part in this incredibly exciting event. So yes, so my name is Patricia Novillo Corvalán. Well done, Michael. Amazing pronunciation, very, very impressed. And I am a literary scholar, so I come from the literature side of things. And yes, I'm based at the University of Kent in Canterbury, and this is in the UK. And I'm a comparativist, and what does that mean? So I work comparatively across English and Latin American literature, and I focus on the relations, the networks, the linkages between modernist writers across both sides of the Atlantic. But I also happen to be very interested in the medicine literature intersections or interface, particularly working around Latin America and representations of illness and disability. I think it's very, very important not to be so Anglo-centric and Eurocentric, within the medical humanities. So that's why my focus is pretty much Latin America. So that's everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. That was nice and succinct. I'm excited to be diving in. But before we do that, I'm going to now introduce Dr. Salvador Moreno, who is Assistant Professor of Medicine at the University of Central Florida. Over to you, Salvador.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much, Sophia and Michael, for the invitation. This is really cool. It's really nice because it really puts me way out of my comfort zone. So I'm also gonna learn a lot, hopefully, definitely. Hopefully you learn something from me. That's a more difficult one. So in my lab, what we're really interested in is in understanding pathogen emergence, basically how bacteria that, you know, they surround us, they're everywhere, how some of them actually gain the ability to colonize us, right? How they can become human pathogens. And we look at kind of this emergence from like different layers, different angles, right? From the, how can a protein become, you know, dangerous to us so that it can give them some abilities to colonize us, to how can one strain become, you know, a pathogen, or how can a pathogen become a pandemic, right? These are all emergent events, and how something that could be localized spreads around the world. So kind of emergence at 3 different layers. And we study members of a family of aquatic bacteria called the Vibrionacea. And they live there, they're happy, they live in their estuaries, in their ponds, in the ocean, but 3 species have actually managed to emerge as human pathogens. One of them that we study extensively, it's called Vibrio cholerae, and it's the agent of the disease cholera, which we're going to be talking about, hopefully, because that's the one that I know. And so yeah, that's kind of pretty much the little summary of what we do.
Great, thank you, Salvador. And finally, on our screens, you'll notice is Professor Richard Gwyn, who's Professor of Creative and Critical Writing at Cardiff University. Over to you to introduce yourself, Richard.
Oh, hi everyone. And likewise, thanks, Sophia, and thanks, Michael, for organizing this and for inviting me. I've got a rather complicated and hybrid academic past, and started off as an anthropologist many years ago, but then kind of absented myself from academia for 15 years. And when I returned, I wanted to do a PhD on kind of linguistic anthropology, but focusing on the representations of medical medical discourse, medical narratives, both in doctor-patient interactions and in media representations of illness at large, mainly to do with kind of health scare stories in the 1990s. But at the same time, I was writing stuff, and midway through, after about 7 years of this career in medical discourse, I got poached by the literature department and asked to teach creative writing, and I thought that was a bit of a doddle compared with teaching linguistics. So I thought I'll go with that, and that's what I've been doing since for the last 20 years. So I describe myself as a writer and translator. I write novels and I translate poetry and short fiction from Spanish, mainly Latin American writers.
Well, thank you, Richard. And it's nice to have what you called a messy history. I think that gives us lots of space to roam around with. That's our material for the discussion, isn't it? I wonder if we can start with quite a broad kind of question about our subject tonight. And I think, obviously, we've said several important Latin American novels have been set against the common backdrop of epidemics. I'd quite like to know why you think these pathogens have been so important to literature in the region. Who fancies taking that first? Patricia, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, shall I say that I like to focus on Garcia Marquez? I think Garcia Marquez, for me, is pretty much the starting point for this discussion. I had read it many moons ago, and it was lovely to kind of reread some of it, not all of it. By the way, it's a very long novel. for those who haven't read it. So I kind of read a few chunks of the novel. So if I may answer that question in relation to my kind of rereading and revisiting of this novel, Love in the Time of Cholera, where we have cholera very much in the background. So, I mean, there's so many things to explore. One of those which I was thinking is how cholera functions in the novel. So how cholera as a disease is understood. And I was thinking that it can be understood in a literal and metaphorical, so literal and metaphorical levels, which are conjoined in the title. So it's when we have the title Love in the Time of Cholera. In some ways, we have to think about the word cholera itself. And in Spanish, the word cholera has a dual meaning, and probably I'd like to emphasize that. So the word itself, so I did a bit of research etymologically, and it derives from the Greek word cholera as well, and that means gut and intestine, and it obviously indicates a form of disease that you know very well, characterized by the forceful evacuation of fluids from the body. So in this way, the word also denotes a personality which is choleric, and this is a wrathful and irascible personality. So what kind of made me think that this sort of pluralistic semantic signification of the term cholera points towards a disease of passion, but also a disease of violence. And I kind of interpret violence as a byword for poverty and injustice, because obviously cholera is a disease of poverty. So yeah, so I kind of felt that the title announces a story of extremes. So if you haven't read Love in the Time of Cholera, you see where love and this kind of poverty dimension, they intersect. So yeah, so that's the kind of the toing and froing between the two. And another thing I thought of as well is that cholera is kind of an omnipresent shadow within the novel, and I would say you have cholera with a big C, the disease, and cholera with a small c, which is the kind of love as a disease, which is experienced by one of the characters, Florentino Ariza. And I think this metaphorical dimension and the literal dimension present cholera in a romantic and experience the symptoms of cholera, yet not the disease, experiencing love sickness. But I think the novel also presents the more harrowing reality of cholera itself. So we also get an unglamorized version of the disease, a disease which shows, you know, in the novel is always kind of ready to strike its deadly blow, having kind of killed numerous people in the novel. So I think the way he handles that meaning is kind of multi-textured. Yeah, so I mean that as just as a starting point, and so much could be said, but I think other speakers should also have something to say, maybe very different to this.
I'd like to add to that, because obviously the connection that Patricia makes between the two meanings of the word cholera in Spanish is salient to the discussion, but it was actually raised in I think the first English language review of Love in the Time of Cholera in the New York Times, which was written by no one other than Thomas Pynchon. And in reviewing Love in the Time of Cholera, he brought to the fore this double meaning of the word, but he took it a little bit further. And he said that in the novel, or rather in the fictional city in which the novel takes place, based, of course, on Cartagena, over this kind of turbulent half century, death has proliferated everywhere, but in both senses, as el cholera, the fatal disease that sweeps through the city, and as choler or anger, which taken to its extreme becomes warfare. And in that favorite phrase of Garcia Marquez, you know, our serial civil wars, it's most manifest as warfare. And victims of the one in this book are more than once mistaken for victims of the other. And war, which is always the same war in Garcia Marquez, is presented here not as a continuation by other means of any politics that can possibly matter, but as a negative force, a plague whose only meaning is death on a massive scale. And against this dark background, lives which are so precarious are often more or less conscious projects of resistance, even of sworn opposition to death. And the other point, which Patricia also mentioned in passing, was the way in which cholera and love are intertwined, not only in the title, but also in the story, which I think we can discuss a little bit later, but I think I've said enough for now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Richard. That was a great introduction to the main themes of love in the time of cholera and to how infectious diseases can be represented in literature. I was wondering, just so we can get all our audience up to speed, if Salvador, you could perhaps give us a very brief, sort of a crash course on cholera, what it is, how it spread, how it emerged and arrived to the geographical regions that it is currently found in.
Yeah, so I think that also has a little bit of adds a little bit of an extra layer, right, to the kind of the fury of the disease. You contract the disease by drinking contaminated water. So right now you have a basic resource. So it's almost like unavoidable. You have something that you need to use, but it's gonna kill you. Point one, and it kills you in a very ugly fashion because you die of dehydration out of so much defecation, right? So it's a kind of like very offensive death, right? Within 24 hours, you just, basically you defecate yourself to death. And, after losing so much water, let's say 25 liters, and if you do the math, if you're 70 kilograms, let's say 25 kilograms are your bones, you are 40 kilograms of flesh and water. Imagine losing 20, right? So it's so basically half of you disappears. So again, that has a very visual connotation associated with the disease. And the way it spreads is by you drink water contaminated with the bacterium. After you defecate, the bacterium goes back into the environment. Somebody drinks the water and it multiplies like wildfire. How it moves around, really simple. Two human necessities, right? Drinking water and the need to defecate. So there's been several, and I don't want to get into too many details. There's been several pandemics of the disease. Pandemic means something that switches from localized to actually being able to spread around the world. And I think that particularly when it comes to the pandemic side of it, because we have endemic cholera in some regions in the world, so particularly in the Bay of Bengal. So there, even if it's more part of kind of like the in some parts the daily life, right? Something that every year you're going to have an outbreak, but when you have the pandemic one, you have something that completely shatters your daily life. So I think that might also tie in with why there are so many novels that have the infectious disease to it, because your life changes. And a good example is, don't tell me that your life last year was the same one as 4 years ago, right? So, I mean, if it wasn't the same, you're the only lucky one. So, so I think that's kind of the most basic cholera 101, unless you have some more questions that I might be more specific about. And CHOL in Greek, it's associated with bile. So it literally means like flow of bile. So that's how what they saw. Somebody was like, like literally pouring their gut intestines contents out. And of course, it's associated with really, specific socioeconomic backgrounds, right? That goes without saying.
Could I just pop in here as well, about the social economic background, because I only learned this week from my daughter, actually, about the identification of cholera, and I'm sure you know about this. Was it in London in the 19th century, when this guy identified the different water pumps in London? Yeah.
I can give you cholera 201 now, and we can go to Jones now.
Yeah, and that was associated with the social classes, wasn't it? Because the poorer people were using this pump, but some of the richer people were also using the pump because they were sending their servants down to get it because it tasted so good.
Yeah, well, you're correct. So basically, now knowing, because back in the day, so actually we have to thank cholera for some things. One of them is like urban structure. Back in the 19th century, cities were built, like basically sprawling, and London was becoming like a major hub. Like most people in Britain was moving to London, but the city had no structure. And if you read, there's a wonderful, quote unquote, wonderful book called The Ghost Map, which tells the story of how the field of epidemiology and urban planning developed because of a massive outbreak of cholera in London in the 19th century. Basically, because they were just, you throw waste, you throw dead bodies, you drink water, you do absolutely everything from the exact same source. Everything goes down to the thing. So back then, since there was no real knowledge of what was the agent of the disease, like 150 years ago, people thought that it was, miasmas and breathing, or, I'm like, I hope you get cholera, and then you get it. That's why, it has these also weird meanings associated to it. But then it was identified that it was a bacterium that lives in the water, that if you drink water contaminated with that bacterium, you can get the disease. And they identified the pump. It's called the Broad Street pump. And there's a pub right across from it. The Jon Snow, not the Jon Snow of Game of Thrones, another Jon Snow, the godfather of epidemiology.
We've already gone straight into like the socioeconomic conditions, but and I think that's an interesting point to discuss, because I think that's obviously tying together some of what you've said about the explosion and the aggression of this. It fits very much into various different socioeconomic shifts, and one of them is in industrialization. But I wonder also, in terms of thinking specifically about Latin America and Latin American identity, how closely is some of that anger and that change associated with colonialism, and how much can this be said to be sort of an expression of a response to that massive shift as a response of foreign aggression, essentially?
Shall I, Patricia, maybe somebody?
Anyone step in if you've got a thought.
I mean, if it's all right, I mean, I like to kind of anchor myself through my answers in the literary text, so that maybe intermingling both perspectives. And I think you're kind of talking about sort of how literature perhaps can raise awareness about diseases in Latin America. So how these representations can, I suppose, show us these inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, and highlight a disease of deprivation, and you say this kind of the awfulness of the disease. And I think, I mean, in relation to Garcia Marquez, so we have, well, Nobel Prize winner and one of the titans of Latin American literature. So I think that in that sense, that the novel has raised public awareness of the disease. And I mean, we're all talking about this now. and it has given the disease visibility, especially as we're all saying. I mean, it's a very unglamorous disease. I mean, it's also a neglected disease. It doesn't get a lot of attention. And also, I think in relation to the socioeconomic level, as far as I know, but please correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, it has been successfully eradicated from the developed world or the global south, yet it's still rampant in Latin America, in Asia. I mean, countries known as the global south. So I think that what literature can do is to sort of make us aware of how the disease can impact the lives of millions of Latin American, in this case, living in poverty. And I'd like to share a personal story, if I may, because I think that combining medical findings with humanities perspective, so, you know, we're talking about a book here, but also films, TV adverts can kind of help reach wider audiences about the broader medical, societal, cultural narratives, I guess, surrounding illnesses. And okay, so I grew up in Argentina in the 1980s and 1990s, and I was, so growing up, I was very aware of very frequent cholera outbreaks taking place up and down the country. So Argentina is a massive country. And I actually remember very, very clearly, even though I was a very young child, all the public health campaigns which were launched by the Ministry of Health. And these were shown on television, I mean, at the time, which has had a tiny black and white television, which barely functioned. But these efforts were seeking to educate the public on basic hygiene, prevention, and I guess eradication of the disease. And I mean, I remember the very dramatic soundtrack of these. They were ominous adverts, and they tended to be extremely long, from like 5 to even 10 minutes. And they featured step-by-step advice on like basic stuff, how to clean toilets, how to dispose of waste, how to sanitize contaminated water by boiling. It would show how to boil basically on the hob. Also how infected rats spread the disease, especially in the rural areas. And I remember one of the things he said, a no was to avoid picnicking in open country roads, I guess, where rodents had been around, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, these adverts, for me, they really stuck. And I could say that most people of my generation, at least in Argentina, I don't know other places of Latin America, would remember them as vividly as I do, so kind of showing their effectiveness. But for me, this sort of bringing together all these narratives, the medical, the prevention, the kind of TV adverts, the book is kind of raising awareness about the disease. Yeah, so that's kind of sharing my personal story as well.
Thanks, Patricia. That's really interesting to get that kind of personal insight. I think also, like, it's kind of interesting thinking about the personal to consider kind of authorial intent and the extent to which it's not just about the kind of dissemination or exploration of illness, but you know, a reaction in anger to this thing that has arrived, you know, and has arrived from foreign shores in this country and then spread like wildfire, you know, to use Salvador's terms back at him, you know, and I wonder how much of that can be perceived in, you know, the subtexts of these works.
Well, if I could come in here, I think in Love in the Time of Cholera, there are quite specific ways in which Garcia Marquez highlights this very point, and cholera is seen as making its way into the country through, I think he says, European ships docking in the harbor. So it's associated as having come from over there, from the old world. And there are various other ways in which the old world is seen as imposing itself upon and contaminating in a fashion the new world. and cholera is the most overt way in which he expresses that. But I think there are possibly also symbolic ways in which he achieves it. And I'm not sure to what extent we want to go into this, but it seems to me that there's a notable absence in much of the critical work on the book surrounding the character of America Vicuña. And America Vicuña in the novel is a 14-year-old girl when we first meet her, who is taken up by Florentino Ariso, one of them, well, the main male character, as he is her guardian, and he initiates a sexual relationship with her. He considers himself to be exempt from moral obligations and chooses to ignore the power dynamics in a relationship foisted by him, a man now in his 70s, on an adolescent. And it's a relationship that elsewhere, I mean, outside of a Garcia Marquez novel, that is, would be termed pedophilic. And he remains oblivious to America's anger, sadness, and self-loathing when, after a couple of years of sexual liaisons, which he closely manages and controls, he abruptly terminates the relationship to devote his energies to Fermina Daza. America shortly thereafter commits suicide. And Florentino and Fermina go off on their love boat journey up the river, kind of immediately at the time of her death. And just looking at the names there, America is obvious, but Vicuña contains within it names were always very important to Garcia Marquez. And he took a lot of time thinking about them. And it bears the name of the continent, obviously, but it also contains almost the Spanish word for a cradle, cuna. And the vicuña, or vicuna, is the name of a species of small camelid ruminant similar to the guanaco, which might also be significant in the context as an indigenous animal. And while America is not an uncommon first name in Latin America, it does seem to me somewhat significant that he should choose it as her first name. This child who's dumped by her protector, abuser, and who in the grip of mortal depression swallows a flask of laudanum stolen from her school infirmary. And so I think this play on words might suggest, in line with the importation of this disease from the European ships, a man whose name Florentino is based on the city, which is seen as the kind of epicenter of Renaissance culture in Europe, should, in a sense, poison this innocent teenage girl who, first of all, he sexually abuses. And I think the symbolism of that, is fairly transparent.
Thanks for that, Richard. It was a beautiful character analysis, really interesting. And once again, it goes to show us how the themes of love and disease and sickness in many ways are interconnected in this novel. Taking that forward and sort of bridging some things that Patricia mentioned and that you mentioned too, Richard, and moving it more towards the science side, in what ways can we see that maybe non-endemic pathogens or old world pathogens or practices have influenced the science, the traditional practices, or the way that research and medicine are treated in Latin America?
So I can join. I don't know, about indigenous practices, right? Medical practices of Latin America, but I think that it's important to know that, even so, if we look at it from the perspective, have these kind of European practices shut down the indigenous ones? Well, if the disease is not endemic, what I see the most critical thing is like something that's brand new. Whether the indigenous practices or the other imposed new practices, at the end of the day, you have a brand new disease that had never been there and that it's, as I said, spreading. So to my knowledge, I mean, there's no records of the disease being there prior to those massive outbreaks. There was a massive one in the 90s, the one that you mentioned, that entered through Peru. We published a paper this year on that topic. And the most recent one was in the Caribbean through Haiti. But these diseases originally are not there. So they just come in, destroy things, and we don't know exactly why they disappear. So I don't think that, indigenous practices might have played, or the lack of a major role. But maybe, again, I'm just assuming that the fact that you are not thinking of how to cure cholera, if cholera does not live there to begin with, right?
Can I maybe jump in? I mean, that's really helpful. I was thinking, I love the history of medicine. So if I may add something related to that. So I was thinking, so I mean, the history of medicine has been impacted by massive epistemological shifts. So you go from the laboratory revolution of the late 19th century, so spearheaded by like medical colossal figures such as Pasteur in France and Robert Koch in Germany. So both of them kind of debunked the old idea, and I think Salvador mentioned this, that diseases were transmitted by these miasmas, which were these kind of foul vapors in the air. And then obviously you have, well, microscopy as well, which is so key in identifying all these bacteria, germs, parasites as the causes of disease, so that kind of the new enemies to be fought. And this is something that we see characterized by Dr. Juvenal Urbino in Loving the Time of Cholera as the doctor who kind of cures, but also is looking at sanitary infrastructures and so on and so forth. So, I mean, so this is modern medicine. When you talk about the kind of indigenous medicine, I mean, for me, is that those practices are extremely important, those healing practices, which are also arts of medicine in their own right, and they're still used in Latin America to great benefit to many people. And I do think that actually the modern scientific medicine can coexist with the local healing practices, and they can kind of complement and enhance each other. And I think that already occurs in Latin America. And I think also in relation to Latin America, one of the things I tend to think about, and I have worked on as well on my research, is also to give due credit to the Latin American scientists, because sometimes you have a disease and there's a Latin America who has done a huge amount of work, and then that scientist or researcher is kind of erased. So while we have in Europe, the Pasteurs and the kind of Kochs in Germany, I was thinking of, because I was doing some work on yellow fever recently, and the one who discovered that yellow fever was actually transmitted by a mosquito rather than miasma was a Cuban doctor called Juan Carlos Finley. So so I think that's really important as well, that we kind of not only are mindful of the importance of the kind of the local healing practices, but also the histories of diseases. I mean, kind of going back to the Aztecs as well, and the brilliant practices that they had, even up to today. And I think there has to be a lot of, and there is obviously international cooperation. So kind of, I think it's key to kind of work at both local and also at an international level. No, when thinking about diseases on the kind of clinical side, but also on the humanity side. I mean, this is why it's lovely that this conversation is taking place, because this is the kind of dialogue one want to have.
May I add a couple of little details, kind of going hand in hand with what you said. One of them, it's because I think that it's critical if we're thinking of, I want to talk about cholera and then about, traditional medicine, let's put it that way, right? Cholera we have to think that within the last 150 years, you have to think very differently from the disease depending on where you are. So this is why I never use the term, developing, that I use limited access to clean water. The reason being is because, 140 years, there was no clean water in London. And because there was no clean water, there was no knowledge of the disease. The disease spread like rampantly, because that kind of puts the blame on the, on the critical situation, right? It's like people either don't know that the water is dirty or know the water is dirty, but they have no access to clean one. So the timeline really matters, right? Because 150 years, 100 years, the knowledge was not so much there. Nowadays, humanity is to blame that the disease exists, because we know it's, if you have access to clean drinking water, you should be able to not get the disease. But if you have access to money, you avoid poverty. And if you have access to food, you avoid hunger too. So that's one thing. Another thing is like, to go back to what you mentioned of, how the medicine kind of like feeds of the modern medicine or Western medicine. Foods, it's a really good example about how humans very early on knew how to avoid bacteria, right? The reason why we like to ferment things, to add spices to things or dry things, is to avoid bacterial growth, avoid growth or prevent them from, and there's tons of studies where, all traditions where, I don't know, you add these, oils to the kid that has diarrhea. Well, it turns out that the oil binds to the active site of a regulator and actually makes the bacterium avirulent, not able to cause disease. So, so it's not completely detached, because at the end of the day, people that do medicine are human that live in the same world and eat the same spices and, or eat the same dry fish, right? So those are my 2 cents on what Patricia mentioned.
What's interesting about that to me is that although we have these similarities, i.e. we have different pathways to trying to deal with certain types of pathogen, without the key thing is that it wouldn't necessarily, or it wouldn't have been described that way in societies that didn't have that same system of medicine, right? So with these new diseases and these new approaches to solving these diseases also came about a new system of understanding how they functioned, a new system of approaching their solution. And I'm curious as to what you all think about how that disrupted traditional knowledge bases and forms of knowledge transmission, and how that existed both culturally but also in the literature, and how the conflict that happens within that space is kind of expressed, because it must have been a very difficult, a very difficult thing to shift, because on the one hand, what do you do? On the one hand, you have these people saying, okay, we have this disease, this is how you solve it. And on the other, you have all of these traditions which have dealt with diseases for as long as your ancestry can remember, in the ways that knowledge cycles are expressed, And I feel like literature is normally a space where that kind of trauma and that kind of generational shift is quite interestingly explored. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's kind of quite broad. So whether we're talking about cholera, and since we're talking also about Latin America, some of the endemic diseases in Latin America, I think are also important. I take endemic means the native diseases, right? And yellow fever has been brutal in Latin America for more than a century. There's also actually tropical diseases in Latin America. Again, as an Argentinian, I grew up being very fearful of contracting what's called Chagas disease, and Chagas disease is a kind of tropical parasitical disease which is caused by a terrifying bug, and it's called the kissing bug because it's vampiric, and it comes out at night out of the crevices of rural dwellings. Again, it's a disease of poverty because it usually afflicts those who live in shanty towns or in very poor locations. And this bug, which is called the vinchuca, would come out and creep on your body and basically suck your blood. And then in sucking the blood, it would defecate, and it would pass on this really pretty fatal virus, and you would just have chronic Chagas, and the disease is devastating. And actually there is literature which has depicted this Chagas disease. There's this brilliant short story writer from Uruguay I would recommend, called Horacio Quiroga. And if anyone wants to look it up, so there's a story, it's only 3 pages long. It's called The Feather Pillow, and it depicts how a woman falls prey to this kind of vampiric, uncanny disease. So that's one of them. But I think in relation to diseases, I mean, from reading Latin American literature and sort of thinking kind of both ways, the representation and the diseases, that I think pretty much we're talking about diseases of poverty, which I mean, remain huge health challenges in the region. So whether you're talking about cholera or Chagas, or there was the other one which cropped up in Brazil, Zika, the Zika virus.
Yeah.
The Zika virus is also transmitted by a mosquito, and I think so similar to the yellow fever one. And yellow fever, I mean, there were so many epidemics well, I was looking at one which struck Buenos Aires in the late 19th century. And there are a lot of very dramatic artistic representations of the disease. So there is research out there where one could be looking at all these discourses, the kind of the medical, and as I was saying, the literature, the art, the films, and I think it's very important as I said before, in raising awareness, and also how these can be sort of tackled both kind of locally and internationally. Yeah, so.
That's great, Patricia. Thank you. It's wonderful to have touched on such an area of infectious diseases, parasites, bacteria, viruses. One
and it wasn't me,
that,
you know? It wasn't me, you know.
One thing that you had touched upon before was this representation of these ads, these advertisements that were going on while you were growing up. And another thing we've all become more aware of in these past 2 years is how much combating infectious diseases is a collective effort and requires coordinated action and requires a very strong leadership. So I'm wondering if we could maybe further explore this role of a leader in how that comes about in infectious disease literature representations, but also how important and fundamental that is in scientific research.
I think also in terms of thinking specifically about the region, you know, the ways in which in colonial and post-colonial societies, it becomes more difficult to act across different communities, whether that disrupts it or whether it forces us to be more international in order to expand beyond simply the geographical space we're in. Mm-hmm. Is there any evidence that this kind of thought process has shifted how we thought of leadership in medical research?
Maybe that's one for you, Salvador.
Not
for me.
Because I mean, when you said literature, I was like, I don't really know.
Going in your direction.
But I truly, you know, it's just that it's. I'm thinking of. I put, you know, in the document that you guys the sent. So I have like 20 examples. Each of them had opposing. So it's just that there is no one answer. Like there's like it really depends. I mean, like you can see right now what we're going through with this pandemic. It looks like we don't learn anything. It's like, you know, pandemics 101 should have been learned March 2020, and we're still, you know, doing the same mistakes. So, however, in some other cases, you know, there's been like some, like for instance, when we were talking about the cholera outbreak in London, that was tackled. Yeah, once data was out there, they identified the pump, boom, done. It's very similar to the Latin American outbreak in the 1990s, the one that you lived through, actually. It entered in 1990. There was no evidence of cholera whatsoever in the Latin American continent for a century. And then all of a sudden, boom, it entered. It took a few years, but there was like a concerted effort throughout the continent, and it was wiped out by the late 90s. You know, so that's pretty striking. Of course, you know, I hope it doesn't take 10 years for, you know, for us to get rid of COVID. You know, that we can act a little bit faster. But that required, like as you mentioned, not only the ads, but they had to change the infrastructure, and you have to think about habits, right? Imagine that tomorrow they say, you know, texting causes, you know, something weird, and then you have to, okay, I have to change my daily life, how I do things, because there's this new disease that was identified. You know, I don't know, the wavelength modifies the proteins in your brain, and you get like prions that give you like mad cow disease. I don't know. Then you have to change your life. That is not a trivial thing to implement, and particularly at a level of an entire continent, and you know, of a continent that's, you know, pretty humongous. And there was this, I don't know if it was concerted, but it led to the demise of the disease, and it's gone. Like, I work with numerous health agencies like the NIH from different countries in Latin America, and it's not in the water. We can't isolate it, which is great. I mean, it's kind of, my job is to not have a job kind of thing. You know, it's like, so it's really gone. So there's leadership sometimes, but as I said, I can also give you 100 million examples of, like, you know, how it's all a total mess.
Actually, if I may add something to what you're saying, because we're talking that major outbreak of cholera was in the 1990s, right? Mm-hmm. It was interesting about how literature can be prophetic in many ways. And Garcia Marquez, if I'm not mistaken, published Love in the Time of Cholera. Was it 1986? You know, I didn't check the date, but 1980s, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of prior to the outbreak. And I think what's really interesting in the novel is that, I mean, this is a novel of love, and it's got a kind of happily ever after ending where all's well that ends well, right? So the two star-crossed lovers, you know, you can think of Romeo and Juliet in a way, but where they grow old and they don't commit suicide. So they get reunited, and there's this kind of ending, this sort of eternal voyage across the Magdalena River. And I think that in a way, so we kind of get this happy ending. And I was thinking about this within the context of these talks. And I thought actually the happy conclusion of this satisfactory ending, I thought it's really deceptive, because the real cholera of the title has not been conquered in the ending. Because do you know how the authorities, the medical authorities, arrive on the ship to investigate a suspected case of cholera? So there's the yellow flag, which is sort of flying on the vessel, and that symbolizes disease. Of course, we know that there isn't cholera, and we know that the lovers have contrived this fiction so that they could stay together. But I think maybe Garcia Marquez is trying to say something there in that particular time, and I think he is warning us of this kind of hazy illusion, and he's very critical of, as much as we have a syrupy and in some way soppy story of sentimental of love. I think also when we were talking about all the meanings of cholera, that so cholera hasn't been conquered, and also we're thinking also about this maritime ending, how in the era of COVID-19 it bears an uncanny resemblance to all those cruise ships quarantined at sea. So I mean, in a way shows fiction's kind of uncanny ability to portray all these experiences of illness, and even to kind of predict events. So I kind of think that Garcia Marquez's probably deeper message on that novel was to say, okay, cholera may strike again, and that even though love has triumphed, the kind of the specter of the disease in a way will continue to haunt Latin America. And there we have in the 1980s, just as the novel came out, all these outbreaks, right? And then that takes us back also to the poverty and sort of inequality issue. So that's, yeah, so I kind of realized that just by having this conversation, you know, the coincidence of date, but maybe if somebody could check Wikipedia when the novel was published, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I agree with your diagnosis, Patricia. I thought it was, I didn't find it a particularly satisfactory ending at all, and I certainly didn't find it happy. If you recall, there are these bloated corpses floating down the river, and the captain of the ship receives a message, presumably from the government, saying that we have orders to tell the passengers that they were accidental drowning victims. So there's all this stuff going on. As you say, the yellow flags raised above. I mean, the two lovers who are in their 70s have this kind of rather malodorous embrace in which they can't stand each other's smell because they smell old, as one of them says. And then he realizes that he must smell just like her because he's even older. And then they try and have sex and he can't quite manage it. I don't really think it's that romantic, the escapade at the end. And apart from this, they can't dock, can they? They can't land anywhere. So there's something of kind of Dante's purgatory going on here with them kind of plying the river up and down, trying to have sex, not quite managing, and then not being able to land anywhere. It sounds a bit frightful. Plus, of course, this sinister understory of the political agenda, which we don't really have access to, but it's not good. And yeah, you're right. It was in the mid 80s that the book came out, which of course was the height of the HIV/AIDS outbreak, wasn't it?
Yep.
But whether there's any significance in that, I can't possibly say.
Thanks. It was nice to have that discussion in there at the end. I should say we're approaching 8, so I'd quite like to quickly throw in some questions we've had from the audience, if that's all right. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Love in the Time of Cholera, but Sonia asked if you could recommend any other good novels in Latin America that deal with infectious disease. And piggybacking on that, Franca adds, or are there any interesting in terms of medical humanities more generally that you'd recommend?
Well, there is Saramago's Blindness. I mean, Portuguese Nobel Prize winner, which is about this pandemic of a very strange case of blindness. I mean, I threw Horacio Quiroga into the mix. I love his stories. So he was a short story writer, and I would recommend The Feather Pillow, which is sort of gothic terror. It's a brilliant read. Don't know, Richard, but I mean, there's kind of so many to think about.
Yeah, well, I was going to defer to you on this. Actually, it's not Latin American, but I just took in when I was looking about cholera specifically. There's a marvelous novel by Jean Giono, in a French novel called Le Hussard sur le Toit, the Horseman on the Roof, which covers the cholera outbreak in Provence in the 1830s, and it's absolutely gruesome, the descriptions of the cholera outbreak there. Okay, it's not Latin America, but it's a great cholera novel.
So I can see a question. Did any of these also reveal? Actually, I don't think Garcia Marquez did, and it is a shame. It would be interesting to know that. Don't know whether, Richard, you know whether Garcia Marquez researched the disease? I mean, I know, for example, somebody like Ian McEwan, when he wrote Saturday, which was about the life of a neuroscientist, that he had lots of kind of tete-a-tete conversations with the neuroscientists. So that's really rich and not whether Garcia Marquez.
I was trying to find the answer to this question, actually, and did some research, and I couldn't find anything to suggest that he did, no.
Well, the novel was based on his parents and the relationship. So now we kind of know very, very little about that, unfortunately. It's a brilliant question, though, and worth really worth considering when you're studying representations of illness and disability would be how much did the author know? I mean, in many cases, you have physician authors, which is really interesting. It's not the case of Garcia Marquez, but, you know, somebody like Anton Chekhov, who was a physician writer, you see, he was kind of very, very well placed. He sort of had a foot in both camps. And many, I mean, Arthur Conan Doyle, he was also had trained as a medic, and we can see that in Sherlock Holmes. I mean, there's kind of lots of fascinating examples of physician writers. I guess not in the case of the ones we are referring to here, but there's there's so much. I mean, if anyone is interested, I'm kind of self-publicizing now. I edited a collection of essays in 2015 on representations of illness in Latin America. So it's called Latin American and Iberian Perspectives on Literature and Medicine, and have various writers who have focused on a variety of narratives, of poetry, short stories, novels, memoirs, and also through lots of parts of Latin America, so Cuba, Argentina, Mexico, and so on and so forth.
Can I ask a question? Because I'm curious, because there's almost like, you know, this kind of like genre, right, or source of inspiration, because we were talking about like how these novels kind of like help inform society, right? But, you know, why do you guys think these are kind of so common, right? The background of a lot of major novels have, you know, this outbreak, this infectious disease, you know, what, I mean, I can come up with some potential reasons, but you guys are the expert. Why do you think that it's such a pervasive theme, you know, that of infectious disease in literature in general, right? So, Richard, Patricia, I'm not the, I just killed my team.
I mean, I'm happy for Richard to take it. I can take it as well, because I've kind of made
After you, Patricia, you go.
Yeah, I mean, there is such a rich tradition of pandemic books, right? And now there's been a surge at the moment, so we're kind of awash with all kinds of narrative blogs, experiences of the pandemic. So I think probably I'm kind of with my comparative hat on. It's nice to think comparatively of these traditions, and you can kind of see an arc of how they develop. So you can kind of go back to pandemic classics such as, you know, Boccaccio's Decameron, and Chaucer's, I mean, Canterbury, of course, the Canterbury Tales. And these both were a collection of stories depicting the horrors of the bubonic plague, right? And that was in 14th century Italy and Britain. And then, of course, you know, you have 20th century books. I mentioned Saramago's Blindness. There's The Plague by Camus. So these are kind of paradigms within the tradition. And I think that writers in many ways have kind of continued and developed these traditions that have been enhanced. I mean, the Latin American writers, so somebody like Garcia Marquez, I mean, he vernacularized these traditions as a Latin America, but I mean, you can trace the genealogy. He was thinking pretty much of having the tragic events of a disease in the background, like Chaucer, like Boccaccio, right?
But my question goes a little bit like, you know, like deeper. What do you know, like, don't you think that diseases kind of also show, like, you know, put us in front of a mirror, you know, like we can use that as a way to, it's almost like war, right? It's like humans killing humans. So you can, you know, come up with many ways to talk about death from that perspective. And you have this different thing, which is humans running around like headless chicken because there's something invisible. And I mean, I don't know anything about this, but I think that must be such a, you know, source of inspiration. Well, the outcome is that there's plenty of works that revolve around, you know, same theme, you know, that kind of invisible enemy, and how, you know, kind of that reflects like the plague. That is a society book. It's not about the disease, right? The disease lets you see society, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, this is part of those books. So if I may kind of finish, if you don't mind, because that follows on from what I was saying. I mean, all these books, Boccaccio, Chaucer, they show how society really breaks apart. It disintegrates with disease and how it's affecting it. So, you know, the disease and the disease of the body politic, as you're saying. Yeah, just that. But Richard, that should.
Yeah, no, I think there's a direct line here between the books you describe, Boccaccio, Chaucer, not forgetting Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, of course, and zombie flicks, because Night of the Living Dead and the TV series Walking Dead exemplify the confrontation of the human with the unknown disease, which is going to wipe us out. And I think zombie films do this perfectly, because, I mean, what can be more terrifying in terms of plague than the representation of people walking around, as you say, like headless chickens, or like zombies. In fact, they are zombies because they've contracted this terrible infection, which is going to turn you into one of them. It's not just a trope for human demise, it's also a trope for contagion, and it's a contagion that can affect us all, that we will end up like that.
Rather bleak note.
I was going to say, sorry, I have the gloomiest of the questions. You know, like, I won't ask any more questions. I just answer.
But yeah, it's a trope. I completely agree with Richard, and you can see it in various literary works, definitely, and it's that breakdown of the social order. Yeah, absolutely.
Which you get explicitly also in the book you mentioned in Saramago's Blindness, the total social breakdown, which actually there's a very good movie of that novel, which is fairly loyal to the novel, in which the scene of the when they enter the city towards the end, it's actually very similar to a zombie film.
I think like what a lot of it goes back to, which summarizes a fair chunk of our discussions in other sessions as well, or at least it's been a theme that we loop back to, is something that's also looped around a couple of times in our chat. You know, one thing Jill said quite early on was that people love medical drama because the more dramatic the better, but sometimes in reality, you know, the suffering of the illness is much less dramatic and doesn't make for the suspenseful reading or television. But in that step from moving to looking at something that feels like mundane because you're coping with a thing, to like understanding it as what Antonia kind of references just now as like a trauma that we then have to deal with, in that process that the writer undertakes, it kind of communalizes this experience of the illness, rather than being that personal quiet suffering on your own with an illness, to understanding this, like these meta levels which become embedded in a narrative as part of the movement into literature and the literary expression of the disease. And I think that's been a really interesting kind of subtext to a lot of what we've talked about, and I think it holds true with what we've talked about today. And I think that's definitely come through in what you were just all three of you were just talking about, really. And if unless anyone has any pressing comments on that as an overarching sweeping statement, I'm quite happy to move that towards our conclusion, since we're now past 8 o'clock, and Sophia, I'm sure, has things to say to wrap up with as well.
Absolutely. No, I think that was a wonderful note to touch on, because one of the aims of BioLit Talks was just to show how much biology and literature have influenced each other. So just like we've talked about science being a source of inspiration for literature, we've also talked about literature making something collective, making it belong to all, and also the fact that public awareness and public perception can very much influence research as well, which is something that we see and we touch every day now. Yes, there's definitely lots of people I'd like to thank. It is the last session, so I'll take my time with the thank yous. But before I do that, just two final things to our attendees. The first one is that Mike mentioned the survey before, just a small reminder of that. Second thing is that 3 out of 4 of our BioLit Talks events have been recorded. So we will make those available online. We will email you once that is done. And for accessibility purposes, we will also make live transcripts available. So if you'd like a copy of that, you can just email us back. Now, moving on to the thank yous, The first and largest thank you goes to Patricia, Richard, and Salvador for making it here tonight. Thank you very much for your availability, for your insight, for all your knowledge. It's been a really rich session. It's been great to have such a multitude of perspectives on such a wide range of topics, and we're really thankful for having you here. A big thank you goes to the Medical Veterinary and Life Sciences Public Engagement team at the University of Glasgow. Big thank you to the Glasgow Medical Humanities Network, in particular Dr. Gavin Miller. He was very supportive when I pitched the idea to him, and he's continued helping us throughout. Thank you to the Dear Gwyn Bothy, which is a collaborative cultural program from the University of Glasgow's College of Arts, which showcases creative and critical responses to the climate emergency. Thank you to the University of Glasgow's PhD Society, in particular Julia Core, who helped me get in touch with those who then became fellow co-organizers of the BioLit Talks. And on that note, of course, a huge thank you to all my fellow co-organizers and all the BioLit Talks team members. A big thank you to Michael Dearwater. He has co-chaired 3 out of 4 of these events and has provided really precious input in the interdisciplinary talking points. A big thank you also to Lorna McBean. She also co-chaired one of the events, and both Mike and Lorna were exceptionally helpful in helping to visualize how we would deliver these events. A big thank you also to Emily Allen and Rachel Lewis. They were the very first 2 people who got in touch with me when I suggested BioLit Talks, and they've really kept us going with their structure, organization, suggestions, and enthusiasm. A big thank you to Patricia Rimby and Cleo Drizza, who have provided plenty of technical support and have kept everything running smoothly online. So every member has been truly valuable and has put in a lot of time, energy, and effort. And finally, a huge thank you to all of the people who have attended these events. It's been a wonderful turnout. Participation has been great. We did not expect to reach so many of you, to interest so many of you. And it's wonderful to know that there's so many people out there who have enjoyed these events as much as we have. So thank you, thank you. I think that's all. It's been a wonderful evening. Thanks again, Patricia, Richard, and Salvador. Thank you all our organizers. Thank you to everyone who attended. Goodbye.